This presentation is called Promote Yourself and Your Research with a Dazzling Presentation. Um, I'm going to focus on oral presentations. So the learning objectives for this webinar are to understand basic components that should be included in an oral presentation of original research findings to a professional audience, to learn key principles of effective slide design, including color, contrast, and balance, to understand how to present information to maximize audience understanding, to learn tips for taking questions from audiences at professional meetings. So this is an overview of this presentation. I'll talk a little bit about knowing your audience and how that information can help you to tailor your presentation to the audience. I'll review certain components that should be included in every sort of standard research talk. I'll talk a little bit about effective slide design for your PowerPoint slides, and I'll say a bit about making transitions from one topic to the next. And I'll also address taking questions in a professional conference setting. So I'm going to start by kind of outlining different components of every sort of generic standard research talk. And so these components are fairly similar to a research article. It's just a more compressed format than a research article. So the hook is a little bit different than a research article, and I'll kind of review what a hook is and some strategies for developing a good hook. Then providing an overview of your talk, an introduction, methods, results, discussion, a summary, and then acknowledgments. And so I'll go over each one of these components with examples. It really varies, but many talks, usually an hour, at least here, is dedicated to a research talk. And often presenters are asked to spend about 45 minutes presenting and leave time for questions. So I wanted to give examples that felt relevant to my audience, which is you in this presentation. So I am imagining that I'm giving a presentation of these research findings, factors associated with long-acting and permanent contraceptive methods use in Ethiopia. So this is a published paper. You may recognize some of the authors, and I will be using this paper as an example throughout. So the first thing I want to mention is just to be sure to know your audience. Often when I give a talk in a new setting, I was recently in New York giving a talk to a new group of people that I hadn't met before. And I probably went back and forth with the person who invited me, maybe 3 or 4 times, making sure that I understood who was in the audience, their level of knowledge about the topic that I was talking about, and trying to just really get as much information as possible about what the goals might be for this audience, to be sure that I was, tailoring the talk to my audience. And so I would say sometimes you already know the audience if you're giving the seminar in your department or something like that. But if it's a new audience, I would say spend the time to try to get to know as much information as possible about the audience, because it will impact the type and amount of background you provide. For example, if you were giving a talk on this topic, let's say long-acting contraceptives and permanent sterilization, and your audience was a group of policymakers, they may not know as much clinical information, and you may need to fill them in on some details about the clinical or the biology of your particular topic. Whereas if you're actually talking to a group of OB/GYN MDs, they of course are going to know much more about the background, the biology, and the clinical information, and you won't need to give as much background. Similar with jargon and other language, you will be able to using jargon is completely acceptable as long as the people in your audience understand the jargon that you're using. And the same goes with other, technical terms or other language. As long as your audience will understand the jargon and language, it's perfectly fine. However, if it's an international audience, say, or an audience that may include some MDs, but it's very mixed in terms of the professional identity of your audience, you're really going to need to take the time to explain terminology in other language so they could really stick with you for the presentation. The same goes for applications of your research. So of course you want to share with your audience, well, how can they use your findings? And that is going to be different for different audiences. So for example, if you are talking to a group of policymakers, you're going to want to emphasize policy applications of your findings. If you're talking to a group of MDs who are OBGYNs, in that case, you're going to want to emphasize how they can use the information in your research study to better improve patient care, for example. Okay, so now I want to move on to the first component that I mentioned of a research talk. This is called the hook. And the hook is basically a mechanism that you can use to draw your audience in to become interested in your presentation. You can do this in a number of different ways. You can tell a story. It can be a personal story about a patient that you saw or an issue that arose in the clinic, or it can be a different kind of story to set the stage, to get people kind of focused on and interested in what you're about to talk about. You can ask a question of the audience and ask people to raise their hands or kind of get your audience involved. Or you can state the problem in stark terms with some statistics or other information that really paint a picture about the problem that your research is addressing. So this may look familiar. This is one example of a hook that you might use for the example research that I'm going to use for this presentation. You might say something like, when I started at St. Paul's in 1999, almost none of my patients had heard of long-acting contraceptives. By 2012, more of my patients were familiar with these devices, and some were even requesting them. But only a certain type of patient seemed to be familiar and comfortable with them. I set out to do this study to find out exactly what the trend was over time and to describe the characteristics of women who were more and less likely to use long-acting contraceptives. So that's just an example of a story you might tell to kind of set the stage, kind of get people ready to hear the research talk and maybe get them interested in the topic. The next thing that should be included in your presentation is an overview, and I encourage you to always include an overview. Cognitive researchers have done research on the best ways to help people pay attention, but also to remember the information from an oral presentation. And providing an overview at the beginning of a talk helps the audience better absorb the information and better remember the information you present during your main presentation. So I suggest that you do not present an overview that looks like this. This is a very generic overview, and it includes just the very sort of generic components that are included in every research talk. Instead, I suggest that you do something along these lines. And I'm going to move this little thing here. You might start by saying, in my presentation, I'm going to begin by giving a bit of background on the Ethiopian governmental priorities for long-acting contraceptives and current level of use. Then I'm going to introduce the data that I used for this study, which is DHS data and the time periods of study. And then I will discuss the time trend for LARC use and factors associated with use. These are my main results. And finally, I'll end with challenges and next steps. So the idea here that your overview should be as specific as possible, and this will really help your audience be able to prepare themselves and their brains for the information that they're about to hear in your presentation. So here's an example of some standard sort of introduction elements that should be included in an oral presentation. So you're going to want to start out, as you do in a research manuscript, convincing your audience why the topic is important, why they should care about your research topic. So for example, this part could, for this example, factors associated with long-acting and permanent contraceptive method use in Ethiopia, you could start by talking about the consequences of unintended pregnancies in Ethiopia. You're going to want to spend a little time giving information about the context and setting of your study, particularly if it's an international audience. An international audience may not understand the basic information about the healthcare context in Ethiopia. Do oral contraceptives cost money in Ethiopia? These basic things will not be clear to an international audience, so you'll need to really fill them in on information that will help them understand your study. Maps are particularly helpful for an international audience to give them a sense of where the study took place. I know that Americans are notoriously horrible at geography, so maps can be very helpful in this regard. You'll want to spend some time describing the problem that you're addressing in your research. So the problem in this particular example is that the government provides free long-acting contraceptives and permanent contraceptives, but use is low. And so trying to understand that a bit more. And then finally, you'll end this section with your research question or objective. And so in this case, it is the examining the trends of long-acting and permanent contraceptive methods and use, and to identify factors associated with its use in Ethiopia. The next section of your talk will be the methods. And again, about 1 or 2 slides on each one of these is probably in the ballpark. You'll want to say something about the data set. So in this particular example, you're using DHS data. So you'll want to give some information about the data set, the sample, who you included in your sample and who you excluded. Variables, you want to very clearly explain what was the dependent variable, what were the independent variables, and also highlight any important covariates. I feel like a lot of times people skip this because you might feel like as the presenter it would seem obvious to the audience. But again, particularly when people are listening orally to information, it's helpful to be very, very clear about each step of your research and to really spell it out for your audience. Of course, you'll want to say something about your analytic approach, and then you'll move on to your results. So you really can only tell a fairly simple story in an oral presentation. And so you'll only be able to present your key results in an oral presentation. And I strongly suggest that you emphasize visual elements because an oral presentation is the visual elements are going to speak to your audience so much more than words. So you could really take advantage of this PowerPoint format and use visuals, figures, tables, photographs, other visuals to really help your audience immediately understand the information that you're presenting. And visual information is also much more dramatic and interesting to look at compared to words or even dense, very dense tables. Where possible, I suggest that you always choose a figure over a table. It's not always possible to make a figure, but be in that mindset of thinking about visuals. So again, this is an example of a table that from that example paper. It's very appropriate for the journal article, but it's not appropriate for a PowerPoint presentation. This is way too much text. And what happens here is when you present an element like this in one of your slides that has a lot of text, you're setting up a situation where you are competing with your slides for the audience's attention. If you show a table like this, people will start to read the table, which is going to take a bit of effort and time. They can't listen to you and read at the same time. So you want to create a situation where you and your slides are working together to help your audience understand the material and remember the material. Okay, so now I'd like everyone to look at this slide, and this is, I recreated this figure from the manuscript, and I just want to show you two different versions of this figure. So we have version number 1 here and version number 2. And so what do you notice about the differences between these two figures? This one and the next one. Having a little bit of trouble figuring out how to get back to my chat. So
I'm monitoring the chat if people want to respond in chat.
Oh, okay, good. So you may notice a few different things about these two different slides. One of them is the width or the bulkiness of each one of the trend lines. And you can see in the second slide, the lines are much thicker. And it seems like it might be a small detail, but it's actually very important to make your lines thick and bold. So they're very easy for people to easily see from the audience. The other thing that's different between these two slides is the labels for each one of the lines. And believe it or not, there's actually been cognitive research on this one detail of presenting information on slides. You could see in this slide here, the labels are really clearly connected with each line. They've done studies to show that this really improves comprehension. And again, it's a small detail, but it's something that can really help you get your point across to the audience much more clearly. So those are just some kind of tips, I guess, in creating, in particular, line graphs, which is something that was part of this paper. Okay, so now let's go ahead and move on to discussion elements. And so the items that should be included in this section are the interpretation of your findings. Might be a biological interpretation or clinical information that you're focusing on, but some kind of processing of the results and kind of an unpacking of the meaning of your results. So thoughts on why, in this example, these changes happened over time. Why, you might not have these data on why this increase in certain contraceptives uptake over time, but you probably have some ideas about why you think it happened. So that would be appropriate to include in this section. And another thing to include would be why certain groups, I think in this paper, the authors were looking at income groups and occupation groups. So why certain groups embraced different methods. So that would be something to discuss. You are on the inside. You are close to this research. You have the insights that are going to help people from outside understand your research. strengths and weaknesses should be included in this section as well. And so I really encourage you. So often I'm sitting in a presentation or I'm reading a paper and I see strengths and particularly weaknesses that are very generic. They're almost so generic that they are meaningless. Something like, oh, we have a small sample size, or oh, um, just something very, very generic. So I would encourage you on both the strengths and the weaknesses to be very specific about what the weaknesses are and, importantly, how it may have impacted your results. So, for example, if you think there might be a bias in your data for, let's say, women underreported using contraception across your entire sample, then this is going to bias your odds ratios toward the null or toward one. So that would be important to point out, to be as specific as possible about what the limitation is and how it may have impacted your results. Now, you won't always know this information, but if you do, I would say definitely include it. And same goes for your research manuscript as well. Applications of your findings, and again, I would say as much as possible, try to tailor this to your audience so that they feel like they can do something meaningful with what they're learning from your research. And that's going to differ depending on the professional identity of your audience. Next step. So of course you want to continue to carry your research forward and think about future research studies and how to expand and move your research forward. So I would be sure and include this as well. And the more specific you are, the better. And then very important, again, cognitive research shows that it's very important to, once you've kind of gone through everything, you give the overview, and then there's the main part of your talk, and then at the end, summarize it again, almost like you have two bookends. And this will help people sort of gel the information that they've learned. And so don't put details in this part, but be specific. Put this in plain language. People are in and out, when you're listening, especially, it might be lunchtime, it might be after lunch, maybe you're kind of, sometimes, our focus wanes and so again, this will just really help if somebody missed something, but also even if they were paying attention to help them gel the information. So here's an example of a summary slide that you could add at the end. LARC and permanent contraception is increasing in Ethiopia, but is low compared to national targets. Okay, that's like a take-home message. The odds of LARC and permanent methods are higher in wealthier sales workers and those who wanted more children. And then the odds of use was lower among women in female-headed households and women with a history of abortion. So this is just an example. It's specific, it's not generic, but it's also not detailed. There's no p-values, there's no odds ratios, etc. The other thing about this summary slide in the take-home kind of messages at the end, you see that these are in fairly plain language. And so if you do have a mixed audience and you're talking about a sort of a somewhat technical topic, this is a place where if maybe some of your audience, they got lost because they didn't have the background to understand every single detail of your presentation, here's where you bring them in again. And they're like, oh, okay, I got the general point. I maybe didn't get every single detail, but I got the general message of this presentation. And then the acknowledgments, very important. I've definitely been at talks, in particular job talks, where someone was interviewing for a job and acknowledgments were not, people were not acknowledged. And people notice that kind of thing. So be sure and thank people who helped you along the way. Of course, you'll want to acknowledge your research funding. Anyone who helped you that didn't really qualify as an author, like maybe nurses or some other type of professional, or, people in the clinic were helping you collect data, whoever. I would say when in doubt, thank somebody rather than leave them out. Now I'm going to transition and talk a little bit about principles of effective slide design. So my first piece of advice is to keep it simple. And again, this is based on cognitive research on how people process and remember information orally and visually in the format of an oral presentation. So this is an example slide that I found on the web, and this is an example of a slide that has too many words. Again, you're really setting up a situation where you're competing suddenly, you're talking, but people are trying to read all the words on your slides, and you don't want that to happen. So I would say avoid complete sentences, only use key words. You shouldn't be writing the period at the end of each of these sentences is a dead giveaway that this is really more appropriate for a publication or a piece of paper. For slides, it's just way too much. So for an effective slide with text, I would say no more than 5 or 6 bullets of text. Do not write in complete sentences. Keep the text short. I suggest that you include a visual on every slide if possible. So, and this slide is about visual information. So if you think about the tension between the presenter and the audience, when you have a slide like this, as a presenter, it might be a little bit easier for you if you're nervous or maybe you're not that familiar with the material, because you can kind of read off the slide. So it might be a little bit more challenging for you if you have more visuals and less text as the presenter. It's also more work because you have to do more preparation and be able to talk off your slides without those cues of having the text there. However, for the audience, having a visual on a slide is much more interesting than looking at a bunch of numbers or a bunch of text. It also, visuals, they've also done research showing that having a visual rather than text will help people remember the information better than just visuals are better than just text. Another principle of good slide design is having one message per slide. And I apologize, this is not an example that is related to reproductive health. But this is a great example of a slide that has a very clear message. Roads cause environmental change. And then 2 visuals. And I think it's very obvious, the before and the after picture. And then you have the arrow that, really clearly sets this up as a before and after comparison. And so there's not a lot on the slide. It's very simple and it's heavy visual emphasis. So this is really a great way to convey information. Another thing I want to emphasize is that when you show a visual element, especially if it's a more complicated figure or element, like a more complicated visual, make sure to take a moment to help your audience get oriented to what they're looking at. So here's an example. So this is not a very complicated figure at all. But if I were presenting this in the context of a research talk, I would first tell people what they're looking at. Okay, so this is a comparison of different types of contraceptive use across time. You can see on the x-axis, the time scale starts at the year 2000 and ends at the year 2016. And on the y-axis, we have percent. This is the percent of women who were using these different types of contraception. We have long-acting permanent methods implant, IUD, and female sterilization. And then move on to talk about what the main point is. And the main point of this slide, not knowing really anything about it myself, seems to be that there was a huge increase in implants and long-acting methods, and female sterilization is basically flat, right? So, but before you you have to remember, you've been looking at this information for so long, you are super familiar with it. And remember that for your audience, it's new information. So they need a little bit of time to kind of get adjusted and figure out, okay, well, what am I looking at here? Animations, I can't stress enough how important animations are to help your audience focus their attention. So again, animations, creating animations is a balance. It's more work for the presenter to go through and add animations. However, it also gives the presenter cues about what to talk about when. So that can be helpful for the presenter. For the audience, it helps you understand what to focus on, especially if the slide is a little busier. You have something happening, an action happening, and your eye is naturally drawn toward the action of the slide, and animations really help you achieve that. Okay, so now I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about design considerations, specifically contrast and color. I think we've all seen slides that are just like impossible to read. It's like white text on a light beige background or something. And so really try to help your audience understand and really process the information you're trying to convey. And one way you can do this is with contrast and color. So this is an example. Again, I apologize. My colleague does research on antibiotic use, antibiotic resistance in chicken farming. So this is the origin of this slide. But you can see the image on the left is a low contrast image, and the image on the right is got lots of contrast. And so you can just see, you can't really make out, there's on the image on the left, there are 4 chickens that are standing right next to each other, and they're all pretty much the same color. And so it's hard to distinguish. And a lot of those other elements, it looks like the camera is pointing right into the sun too. So the background is washed out. So you could see the difference between an image with really good contrast is super easy and clear, and then the image with low contrast. Okay, and so this slide is about the use of color. So these maps are not showing the exact same information, but they are both showing low to high values geographically. And so which map do you feel like is more effective? The map on the left or the map on the right? We can't see the key in either one of these maps. And so I suspect, I've shown this map to many audiences, and almost every time people choose the map on the right as the map that is more obvious. And people typically say that the lighter colors look like they represent lower values, and the darker colors represent higher values. And that's just how our eye naturally sees information. It's a very logical way to organize the colors in your presentation. It's a very just intuitive color scheme for people to understand. Light is low and dark is high. And so you almost don't really need a key. You can say, you know, okay, well, it looks like in terms of global water stress, and that is not water availability. That has to do with how you're managing your resources. The lighter colors, those people probably have low water stress. And the darker up here in the north and down in the southern area, that's going to be higher water stress. And the map on the left, it's just like there's no rhyme or reason to those colors. There's also way too many colors. Your brain can really only process 5 or 6 colors at the most. But when they're so random like this on the left, it's really hard to make sense of what they mean. So again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there's 7 hues or 7 shades, I guess, of this light to dark. I would argue that some of these are probably too similar to really get your point across, but you get the idea. This is a great way, and if you're using, if you want to use lighter shades to darker shades in a print publication, let's say that it's going to be in black and white, you can still use this idea. Just use it as a grayscale. So it would be on the left, it would be still white, but on the right, it would be black. And then in the middle would be all these different various shades of gray. Okay, so a few more thoughts on design considerations of organizing to help your viewers process information. So again, this was a makeover I did in one of the workshops in last time I was in Ethiopia, maybe, or the time before that. Again, this is from a manuscript. This is totally appropriate for a manuscript. However, if you are showing the same information for a presentation, then I would suggest presenting it something like this as a figure. And you could see, like the instant you look at this, you know, you really get a sense of like, okay, there's 3 comparison groups and you could see which one is higher. It's very easy to get your brain around compared to looking at a table when you're sitting down in the audience. So effective transitions, as I have been talking to you so far, I have transitioned from topic to topic. Started out talking about the elements that should be included in a presentation. Then I moved to design considerations. And every time I transitioned, I had a transition slide that looked like this. And so it's a good idea to give your audience cues like, okay, we're shifting gears. I'm going to start to talk about something else. So transitions help you bring your audience from one topic to the next, helps you improve the flow of your talk. Transition slides can be a great way to do that. That's how I do it. You could also use verbal transitions or even both, just to help your audience kind of stick with you and really keep track of the information that you're presenting. And so this is an example of my transition slides. They all, I think, some of them are yellow on top and some of them are blue. Ideally, they would all match. So your audience would really recognize, okay, we're shifting gears here a little bit. Okay, so now I want to shift and talk about taking questions in the context of a professional meeting. Questions are really important. I mean, one of the main purposes in presenting at a professional conferences, aside from making network contacts, is to really have that two-way exchange with your audience. Often you're presenting a piece of research that you haven't finalized yet, that you're still just finishing up the analysis, and you know you're getting feedback from other experts in the field that's going to help you give insights on your data and maybe some ideas about how to, you know, revise your analysis or other information that may help inform your research. So questions are really important. They're a very important part of the presentation. At the beginning of your talk, I suggest to let your audience know if it's okay to stop you with a question or if you want people to save your questions to the end. And sometimes your organizer, your conference organizer, will have a preference and will tell you, you know, there's no time. Don't take questions during the talk. Please, you know, we can take 2 questions at the end or whatever. But it's good to let your audience know that up front so they know what to expect and what you want from them. When I give a new talk on a new topic, I typically try to anticipate 3 questions that I think I might get from the audience, and I write out responses beforehand. so I can be sure and be prepared in answering those questions. Now, this next tip is just so important. I'm so often you're at a conference, and if it's a big group of people, it's a big audience, someone in the back may ask a question, or maybe it's someone like way at the front and you're sitting way at the back, and you didn't hear the question. And then the presenter starts answering the question. But unless the presenter repeats the question, you can feel very lost. And when you're sitting in the audience, it's really, really important to know what was the question that was asked so you can kind of follow along. So as the presenter, when you get a question, I would suggest immediately repeat the question. That will help others in the audience understand what question was asked. It will also help you be sure that you understood the question correctly. It seems like there's always someone who has this kind of long rambling. Um, you're not sure if it's a question or if it's a comment, and so by repeating it, then you can make sure that you're communicating with the questioner clearly as well. I also think it's a good idea, and this is, in some ways it's like a personal style, but I like to thank the person for asking a question. I really appreciate it when people take interest in my presentation. And so it's sort of just a gracious thing to do is just to really thank the person for asking the question. It's totally appropriate to say, I don't know. And it's, of course, much better to say, I don't know than to just kind of wing it. And if you're not really sure, sort of answering in an uncertain way. So it's totally appropriate to say, I don't know, can I get back to you offline? Or can I follow up after the talk? That's a really good point. I hadn't really thought about that before. So that's a good, definitely an appropriate response to a question. Okay, so when I think about my 3 questions I think people might ask, often I will prepare extra slides and put them at the very end of my presentation. I won't necessarily show them unless somebody asks a question related to my extra slides. So for example, this is from a talk I gave a while ago on a research study I did on healthy neighborhoods. And I didn't know how much the audience was going to be interested in the statistical approach. So I wrote out the model that I used and I stuck it at the end, and I thought, okay, well, if someone wants to know the details of the model that I used, I'll have a slide all prepared, and I'll just be able to kind of click through and show this slide. But this is not a slide that was in part of my main presentation. So again, I didn't know about how much this audience cared about causal inference. I had this as the another extra slide, etc. So another tip I have for you about preparing a presentation is to use a widescreen in PowerPoint. So when you open a generic PowerPoint document, the default will be the slide size. You can see it right here on the screen. It's under the Design tab, and if you go to Slide Size, it by default goes to a 4:3 ratio. A 16:9 will give you a little more space, a little more real estate, and so I suggest using 16:9. It gives you a little more room to work with. Here's a checklist you can use when you're planning your talks. Think about the purpose of the talk. If it's a standard research talk, the purpose is pretty obvious. It's just to share your findings. Learn as much as you can about the audience. The style of the presentation, again, That tends to be connected with the purpose. The length, that's very important to ask how much time you're going to have and how much time you want, your presenters want you to leave for questions. Think about what your hook is going to be. Choose a PowerPoint theme, create an outline, and then make a schedule that allows you to practice and make sure that your timing is really stays on track. Okay, that is the end of my presentation.
One question that came to my mind, Ella, is you gave really wonderful concrete examples throughout your presentation, and a lot of them focused on doing a presentation to highlight research specifically. Are there kind of, and I think a lot, even though you focus on research, a lot of them are transferable to doing presentations about other things, like if any of our investigators are just called upon to like represent their program or their department. If
Yes. So,
if they were doing like a non-research presentation, it seems a lot of these things are transferable, but are there any other tips you would add for doing a non-research presentation?
I would just say think about the purpose of the presentation, and I suggest that you try to find an example of a similar presentation. Each type of presentation tends to have specific conventions. So one example is what we call here the job talk. So that's when you're interviewing for a faculty position and you're asked to give a talk. So a job talk would be somewhat similar to a research talk, but it would be a more of a big picture look at your research themes in your career. And so it would be a little bit different in terms of the style and the conventions. If you were asked to present about your department, my advice would be to ask a colleague who has done that type of presentation before for an example of their PowerPoint slides and see what elements and components are included and try to emulate that. Because each type of discourse, each type of presentation is going to have its own conventions, its own style. And so using examples are really the best way to model your own presentation, especially at the beginning when you're first starting out.
Great, thank you.